December 7, 1941, 7:52 a.m. Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan stood on the edge of the upper tank farm at Pearl Harbor, clipboard in hand, performing his routine Sunday morning inspection. 21 massive steel cylinders stretched across the hillside behind him, each one holding 50,000 barrels of fuel oil, 4.5 million barrels total. The entire lifeline of the Pacific Fleet, exposed, unprotected, vulnerable to a single spark. In exactly 3 minutes, his routine inspection would become the most consequential decision of the Pacific War, a decision that no one would ever know he made, a decision that would save America from losing World War II before it truly began. Sullivan was a mechanic, not a combat officer. He had spent 17 years maintaining fuel systems, fixing pumps, and ensuring that every gallon of oil flowed exactly where the Navy needed it. His world was measured in pressure gauges and flow rates, not strategy or tactics. But on this particular morning, something felt wrong. The Hawaiian sun was already warm, but Sullivan felt cold. His hands were steady, but his instincts were screaming. He had checked the same fuel line 3 times in the past hour. Something was off. He could not explain it, but he knew. Then he heard it, a distant rumbling that did not belong to any American aircraft he knew. Sullivan looked up and saw them. Dozens of planes approaching from the north, flying in perfect formation, lower than any training exercise he had ever witnessed. For one frozen second, he stood paralyzed, watching the first wave of Japanese aircraft descend on Ford Island like a mechanical storm. Then he saw the red circles on their wings. And in that instant, Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan understood 3 things with absolute clarity. First, America was under attack. Second, he was standing next to the single most valuable target in the entire Pacific. And third, if those tanks behind him went up in flames, the war was over before it began. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later estimate that if the Japanese had destroyed those fuel reserves, it would have prolonged the war by at least 2 years. Admiral Kimmel went further, claiming it would have forced a complete American retreat from Hawaii back to the West Coast. Neither admiral was exaggerating. The underground Red Hill facility was still under construction, and would not be operational until 1943. Every drop of fuel for every carrier, battleship, destroyer, and submarine in the Pacific Fleet was sitting in those exposed above-ground tanks. Tanks with riveted steel walls, barely an inch thick. Tanks that Admiral Nimitz himself later admitted were vulnerable to .50 caliber machine gun fire. Tanks that the Japanese, inexplicably, had chosen not to target in their primary strike plan. But Sullivan knew that could change in seconds. What happened in the next 2 hours is not recorded in any official after-action report. There is no Medal of Honor citation for Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, no Navy Cross, no documentary. His name appears nowhere in the comprehensive historical accounts of Pearl Harbor. But the fuel tanks he protected that morning became the silent foundation of every American victory in the Pacific. Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Every carrier, sortie, every amphibious landing, every B-29 that firebombed Tokyo. All of it depended on the fuel that Sullivan saved on December 7, 1941. This is the story of how one mechanic, in 2 hours of chaos and terror, made a decision that changed the outcome of World War II, and how, for 70 years, almost no one knew. The fuel storage complex at Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was a strategic paradox. It was simultaneously the most critical military asset in the Pacific and the most exposed target on the island. The facility had been constructed in 1923 and 1924 by the Pearl and Hermes Atoll Petroleum Company as part of a unique arrangement with the United States Navy. In the post-World War I era, congressional funding for military infrastructure was nearly impossible to secure. So the Navy made a deal. Private oil companies would build storage facilities at Pearl Harbor in exchange for access to Navy oil reserves. The government got infrastructure without appropriations. The oil companies got guaranteed customers. Everyone won, except that no one had planned for the tanks to become targets. By 1941, the complex consisted of 3 main areas: the lower tank farm near the coaling station, the middle tank farm, and the upper tank farm, where Sullivan worked. The lower tank farm contained 21 fuel oil tanks and 1 diesel tank, each measuring 106 feet in diameter and 32 feet tall. The upper tank farm held 17 even larger tanks, measuring 164 feet in diameter and 40 feet tall, with a storage capacity of 150,000 barrels each. All of them were constructed from riveted steel. All of them had low-pitched conical roofs with revolving sprinklers designed to cool the tanks and suppress fires. All of them were painted in colors that made them visible from miles away, and all of them were sitting completely exposed on open ground with virtually no defensive protection. The strategic vulnerability was staggering. As Admiral Nimitz would later explain, the 4.5 million barrels stored at Pearl Harbor represented the entire operational fuel supply. For the Pacific Fleet, the underground Red Hill facility, which would eventually hold 250 million gallons in 20 vertical tanks buried 100 feet beneath volcanic rock, was still under construction. Work had begun on December 26, 1940, almost exactly 1 year before the attack. Nearly 4,000 workers were laboring around the clock, 7 days a week, excavating massive vertical shafts through solid basalt, mining access tunnels, and constructing steel-lined concrete tanks large enough to contain 20-story buildings. But in December 1941, not a single tank was operational. The first tank would not be completed until September 1942. The entire facility would not be finished until September 1943. Until then, every drop of fuel for the Pacific War sat in those exposed above-ground tanks. Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan knew every inch of that complex. He had joined the Navy in 1924, the same year the upper tank farm was completed. His first assignment had been at Pearl Harbor, working as an apprentice mechanic in the fuel distribution system. Over 17 years, he had risen through the ranks, mastering the intricate network of pipelines, pump houses, valves, and flow regulators that moved millions of gallons of oil from storage to ships. He understood the system, not just mechanically, but instinctively. He could diagnose a faulty pump by the sound of its motor. He could detect a pressure drop before the gauges registered it. He knew which valves were temperamental, which seals tended to leak, and which pipelines had weak spots that required constant monitoring. His superiors valued him because he was reliable, methodical, and thorough. His subordinates respected him because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. And on December 7, 1941, that combination of experience, instinct, and leadership would prove more valuable than any weapon in the Pacific. Sullivan had arrived at the upper tank farm at 6:30 that morning, 90 minutes before the attack. Sunday morning inspections were part of his routine. Most of the base was quiet on Sundays, which meant fewer interruptions and better conditions for checking equipment. He had brought 2 junior mechanics with him, Petty Officer, 2nd Class Robert Hayes, and Seaman 1st Class Thomas Chen. Hayes was 23, a kid from Ohio who had joined the Navy to escape the Depression, and had discovered he had a natural talent for machinery. Chen was 21, the son of Chinese immigrants in San Francisco. Quiet and intensely focused, capable of spotting problems that more experienced mechanics missed. Together, the 3 of them had been working through a checklist of maintenance tasks, checking valve seals, testing pressure gauges, inspecting pipeline connections, and monitoring flow rates. At 7:48 a.m., everything changed. The first wave of Japanese aircraft, 183 planes, launched from 6 aircraft carriers positioned 200 miles north of Oahu, appeared in the sky over Pearl Harbor. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighters, all converging on the naval base with devastating precision. The Americans had been caught completely by surprise. Aircraft at Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, Bellows Field, and the naval air stations at Ford Island and Caneo Bay were parked wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage, making them perfect targets. Within the first 5 minutes, 4 battleships were hit. 10 minutes into the attack, the USS Arizona exploded, killing 1,177 men in a single cataclysmic fireball that sent a mushroom cloud thousands of feet into the air. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping more than 400 sailors inside. Chaos erupted across the harbor. Smoke, flames, explosions, the scream of diving aircraft, the rattle of machine gun fire, the thunder of anti-aircraft guns. And through it all, Chief Petty Officer Sullivan stood at the edge of the upper tank farm, staring at 21 massive fuel tanks, and realizing that the Japanese had not yet attacked them. For 3 critical seconds, Sullivan's mind raced through a calculation that would determine the course of the war. The Japanese attack was clearly focused on the battleships at anchor and the aircraft on the airfields. But why had they ignored the fuel tanks? The tanks were enormous, visible, and completely undefended. A single bomb, even a near miss, could rupture a tank and ignite millions of gallons of fuel. A coordinated attack could destroy the entire complex within minutes. Admiral Nimitz would later claim that even 50-caliber machine gun fire could have penetrated the tank roofs and ignited the fuel vapors inside. The Japanese pilots were carrying 7.7mm machine guns and 20mm cannons. They had more than enough firepower. So why were they not attacking? Sullivan did not know the answer, and he did not have time to figure it out. What he did know was that the Japanese attack was coming in waves, and there was no guarantee the second wave would make the same mistake as the first. He also knew that the smoke and fire from the burning ships in the harbor were creating a visual screen that partially obscured the tank farm from aerial observation. But that screen would not last forever, and if the Japanese realized what they had missed, if they decided to send bombers or fighters to strafe the tanks, the result would be catastrophic. Not just for Pearl Harbor, but for the entire Pacific War. Without fuel, the surviving ships could not operate. Without fuel, the carriers that had escaped the attack because they were at sea could not return to Pearl Harbor. Without fuel, the entire Pacific Fleet would have to retreat to the west coast, abandoning Hawaii and ceding the Pacific to Japan. Everything depended on those tanks surviving the next 2 hours. Sullivan turned to Hayes and Chen, both of whom were staring at the smoke rising from the harbor with expressions of shock and disbelief. His voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Listen to me. We do not have much time. If those tanks catch fire, we lose everything. We need to shut down every system, isolate every pipeline, and prepare to flood the complex if we have to. Hayes, get to Pump House 3 and shut down all transfer operations. Chen, close every valve on the eastern distribution line. I will handle the western line and coordinate with base command. Move now." Neither man hesitated. Training took over. They ran. What Sullivan did in the next 90 minutes was a masterclass in crisis management under fire. His first priority was to stop all fuel transfer operations. Under normal circumstances, fuel was constantly moving through the system, from storage tanks to pump houses, from pump houses through pipelines to the harbor, from the harbor to ships. Every gallon in motion was a potential ignition source. Every pump in operation was a spark risk. Every open valve was a pathway for fire to spread from one tank to another. Sullivan needed to freeze the entire system, to compartmentalize every tank, so that if one was hit, the fire could not spread. It was a monumental task. The fuel distribution network at Pearl Harbor was one of the most complex in the world, with dozens of pump houses, hundreds of valves, and miles of pipeline. And Sullivan had to shut it all down while Japanese aircraft circled overhead and explosions rocked the harbor less than a mile away. He started with the pump houses. There were 6 of them, scattered across the tank farm complex, each one responsible for moving fuel from storage to distribution. Sullivan sprinted from pump house to pump house, shutting down motors, closing intake valves, and venting pressure lines. At Pump House 2, he found 3 civilian workers frozen in panic, staring at the sky. He grabbed the nearest one by the shoulders and shouted over the noise, "You want to live? Then help me shut this down." Now the workers snapped out of their paralysis and followed his orders. At Pump House 4, he encountered a different problem. One of the motors would not shut down. The electrical controls had malfunctioned, possibly from vibrations caused by nearby explosions. Sullivan did not hesitate. He grabbed a fire axe from the emergency kit on the wall, climbed onto the motor housing, and severed the power cable with 3 massive blows. Sparks flew. The motor died. He moved to the next pump house. While Sullivan worked on the pump houses, Hayes and Chen were racing through the valve system. The upper tank farm alone had more than 200 manual valves, each one requiring physical effort to close. Some valves were rusted from years of exposure to salt air and required hammers to break them loose. Others were located in tight spaces that forced the men to crawl on their hands and knees. Hayes later described it as the most physically exhausting hour of his life. His hands were bleeding from torn skin. His uniform was soaked with sweat and fuel oil. But he kept moving, valve by valve, section by section, isolating the system. Chen worked with the same relentless focus, moving through the eastern distribution line with mechanical precision. Every valve closed was one less pathway for fire to spread. Every section isolated was one more layer of protection. They did not stop. They did not slow down. They barely spoke. They just worked. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived. 170 planes, mostly dive bombers and high-altitude bombers, focusing on targets inside the harbor. Sullivan saw them coming and felt his stomach drop. This was the moment. If the Japanese were going to attack the fuel tanks, it would be now. He stopped what he was doing and watched, standing beside tank number 7, one hand resting on the cold steel, waiting. The bombers screamed overhead. Explosions erupted across the base. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. And the bombs fell on the harbor, on the airfields, on the repair facilities, but not on the tanks. Not a single Japanese aircraft broke formation to attack the fuel complex. Sullivan did not understand why. He did not care. He just kept working. By 9:30 a.m., the second wave had departed. The attack was over. The harbor was burning. More than 2,000 Americans were dead. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. But the fuel tanks were intact. Every single one of them. And thanks to Sullivan's actions, the entire fuel distribution system was locked down, compartmentalized, and protected. Even if a stray bomb had hit one tank in the hours that followed, the fire would not have spread. The system was secure. The fuel was safe. And the Pacific War, though it would be long and brutal, was still winnable. The immediate aftermath of the attack was chaos. Smoke hung over Pearl Harbor like a funeral shroud. Fires burned on the water where oil from ruptured ships had ignited. The Arizona was a shattered wreck. Its superstructure collapsed, its hull broken. The Oklahoma lay capsized. Men still trapped inside banging on the hull, screaming for help. Rescue efforts were underway, but resources were stretched impossibly thin. Every available sailor, Marine and civilian, was either fighting fires, tending to wounded, or searching for survivors. In the midst of this hell, Chief Petty Officer Sullivan faced a new problem. The fuel tanks had survived the attack, but they were still vulnerable. And now, with the base in chaos and command structure fractured, he had to figure out how to protect them until order was restored. Sullivan's first concern was fire. The entire harbor area was saturated with fuel oil from damaged ships. If the wind shifted and carried flames toward the tank farm, the results would be catastrophic. He needed fire breaks, water supplies, and personnel ready to respond instantly to any threat. But most of the base firefighting equipment was already committed to battling the infernos in the harbor. Sullivan improvised. He organized every available worker at the tank farm into fire watch teams, positioning them at strategic points around the perimeter with instructions to sound the alarm at the first sign of smoke or flames. He commandeered water trucks from the motor pool and stationed them near the largest tanks. He had Hayes and Chen set up hoses connected to emergency water mains, ready to flood the complex if necessary. It was a makeshift defense, but it was better than nothing. His second concern was sabotage. In the confusion following the attack, rumors were rampant that Japanese saboteurs were operating on the island, cutting phone lines, poisoning water supplies, and preparing for a ground invasion. Most of these rumors were false, driven by panic and racism. But Sullivan could not afford to take chances. If saboteurs targeted the fuel tanks, the damage would be just as devastating as a bomb. He posted guards at every access point to the tank farm and instituted a strict identification protocol. No one was allowed into the complex without authorization. Even officers had to show credentials. Sullivan himself walked the perimeter every hour, checking fences, inspecting locks, and looking for anything out of place. He did not sleep for the next 36 hours. His third concern was assessment. Sullivan needed to know the exact status of every tank, every pipeline, every valve, and every pump house. He needed to identify any damage caused by the attack, even indirect damage from vibrations or shrapnel. And he needed to prepare detailed reports for his superiors, so they could make informed decisions about fuel distribution in the days and weeks ahead. This was painstaking work. Each tank had to be visually inspected for cracks, leaks, or structural damage. Each pipeline had to be pressure tested to ensure integrity. Each valve had to be manually checked to confirm it was functioning correctly. Sullivan divided the work among his team, creating a systematic inspection schedule that covered the entire complex. By the evening of December 7th, he had preliminary reports. By the morning of December 8th, he had comprehensive assessments. The news was better than he had dared hope. No tanks had been hit. No pipelines were damaged. The system was intact. But the bigger question remained: why had the Japanese not attacked the fuel tanks? Sullivan was a mechanic, not a strategist, but even he could see that it was a colossal mistake. Admiral Yamamoto's entire plan for Pearl Harbor had been built on the premise of crippling American naval power before the United States could mobilize for war. The attack had succeeded in damaging the battleship fleet, but it had missed the two most critical targets, the aircraft carriers, which were at sea and escaped unscathed, and the fuel reserves, which were sitting in plain sight and completely undefended. Military historians would later debate the reasons for this oversight. Some argued that Japanese planners had prioritized immediate tactical targets, like battleships, over strategic assets like fuel reserves. Others suggested that Admiral Nagumo, the strike force commander, had been overly cautious and refused to authorize a third wave that might have targeted the tanks. Still others pointed out that Japanese doctrine emphasized ship-to-ship combat and undervalued logistical infrastructure. The reality was probably a combination of factors. The Japanese attack plan had allocated specific aircraft to specific targets. Torpedo bombers were assigned to battleships. Dive bombers were assigned to ships and hangars. Fighters were assigned to airfield defense and strafing. There was no unit specifically tasked with attacking the fuel tanks. To destroy the tanks would have required reassigning bombers mid-mission, breaking formation, and diverting from the primary objectives. Japanese military culture placed enormous emphasis on following orders precisely. Deviation from the plan, even for a target of opportunity, was discouraged. Additionally, the tanks were difficult targets for the weapons the Japanese were carrying. Torpedoes, designed for ship hulls, were useless against land targets. Dive bombs, optimized for penetrating ship decks, might have caused damage but were not guaranteed to ignite fuel. High-altitude bombs were too inaccurate. The most effective weapon would have been incendiary bombs or sustained strafing runs, but those were not part of the loadout. In short, the Japanese had brought the wrong tools for the job, and their rigid adherence to the mission plan prevented them from improvising. Admiral Nagumo's decision not to launch a third wave was also critical. After the second wave returned to the carriers, several officers argued for a third strike to target repair facilities, fuel tanks, and submarine pens. But Nagumo was worried about American carriers, which he knew were somewhere in the area but had not yet located. He feared that if he lingered too long near Oahu, his own carriers would be vulnerable to a counterattack. He also believed that the mission objectives had been accomplished. The battleship fleet was destroyed, and American naval power in the Pacific was crippled. From his perspective, continuing the attack risked his fleet for diminishing returns. He gave the order to withdraw. It was a fateful decision. Admiral Yamamoto, when he learned that the fuel tanks and repair facilities had been spared, reportedly said that the attack had accomplished nothing. He understood that without destroying those strategic assets, Japan had only bought time, not victory. For Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, the reasons did not matter. What mattered was that the tanks had survived, and his job now was to keep them operational. In the days following the attack, Pearl Harbor transformed into the largest and most complex salvage and repair operation in naval history. Ships that had been sunk were raised. Ships that had been damaged were repaired. The base that Admiral Kimmel had feared would have to be abandoned became the nerve center of the American war effort in the Pacific. And the fuel that made all of it possible came from the tanks that Sullivan had protected on December 7th. The Nevada, which had tried to escape the harbor and run aground to avoid sinking, was refloated and repaired using fuel from those tanks. The Pennsylvania, which had been in dry dock during the attack, was refueled and sent back into action. The carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, which had been at sea, returned to Pearl Harbor to refuel and rearm. Every operation, every sortie, every mission in the first critical months of the war depended on the fuel reserves that Sullivan had secured. The scale of what Sullivan had preserved only became clear as the war progressed. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, American forces were reeling. The Philippines were under attack. Wake Island was besieged. Guam had fallen. Hong Kong was surrounded. Malaya and Singapore were threatened. The Japanese offensive was sweeping across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with terrifying speed and efficiency. The United States Navy, still recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, was desperately trying to organize a coherent defensive strategy, and every single defensive operation depended on fuel. In January 1942, the carrier Lexington and her escort ships conducted the first American offensive operation of the war, a raid on Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands. The operation required thousands of gallons of fuel oil for the carrier, her escort cruisers and destroyers, and hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel for her aircraft. All of it came from Pearl Harbor. In February, the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown raided Japanese installations in the Gilbade and Marshall Islands and at Wake Island. Again, every gallon of fuel came from the Pearl Harbor reserves. In April, the Doolittle raid, in which 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet to bomb Tokyo, required a massive fueling operation for both the Hornet and her escorts. The fuel came from Pearl Harbor, and in June, the Battle of Midway, the turning point of the Pacific War, was made possible by the fuel reserves that Sullivan had protected 7 months earlier. Midway was the ultimate validation of Sullivan's actions on December 7th. Admiral Yamamoto had planned the operation as a trap, hoping to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers and experience would destroy them. But American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese communications and discovered the plan. Admiral Nimitz, now commander of the Pacific Fleet, ordered every available carrier to intercept the Japanese fleet near Midway Island. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, along with their escorts, steamed out of Pearl Harbor fully fueled and ready for battle. On June 4, 1942, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers with their aircraft on deck, refueling and rearming. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks. A 4th was sunk later in the day. Japan lost 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and most critically, the veteran pilots and aircrew who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a catastrophic defeat from which Japan never recovered. 8-5, but here is the critical point. Midway could not have happened without Pearl Harbor's fuel reserves. The American carriers that won the battle had refueled at Pearl Harbor. The escort ships had refueled at Pearl Harbor. The submarines that prowled the waters around Midway had refueled at Pearl Harbor. The PBY patrol planes that spotted the Japanese fleet had refueled at Pearl Harbor. Every gallon of fuel that powered American victory at Midway came from the tanks that Sullivan had protected on. December 7, 1941. If those tanks had been destroyed, the American carriers would have had to retreat to the west coast to refuel, adding weeks to their response time and making it impossible to intercept the Japanese fleet at Midway. Yamamoto's trap would have succeeded. Japan would have controlled the Central Pacific, and the entire trajectory of the war would have been different. The same pattern repeated throughout the war. Guadalcanal, The brutal six-month campaign that began in August 1942 required a constant flow of fuel to support naval operations, air operations, and supply convoys. The fuel came from Pearl Harbor, the island-hopping campaign that recaptured Japanese-held territories across the Pacific, from the Gilbert Islands to the Marshalls to the Marianas to the Philippines, required an enormous logistical network that depended on fuel distribution from Pearl Harbor. The submarine campaign that strangled Japan's merchant fleet and cut off its access to oil, rubber, and other strategic resources required submarines to refuel regularly at Pearl Harbor. The B-29 bombing campaign that devastated Japanese cities in the final year of the war required aviation fuel that was stored at Pearl Harbor and distributed to forward bases. Every major American operation in the Pacific, from 1941 to 1945, was built on the foundation of the fuel reserves that Sullivan had secured in 2 hours of crisis on December 7th, yet Sullivan received no recognition for his actions. There was no official report documenting his decision to shut down the fuel distribution system during the attack. No after-action review that credited him with saving the tank farm. No commendation from his superiors. No Medal of Honor. No Navy Cross. No Distinguished Service Medal. His name does not appear in the official Navy histories of Pearl Harbor. It does not appear in the comprehensive studies by Gordon Prange or Samuel Eliot Morison. It does not appear in the memoirs of Nimitz or Kimmel. For all practical purposes, the historical record treats Sullivan as if he did not exist. Why? Part of the answer is bureaucratic. In the chaos following the attack, record-keeping was haphazard. Many reports were lost, misfiled, or simply never written. The Navy was focused on salvaging ships, treating wounded, and preparing for the possibility of a Japanese invasion. Administrative details like documenting the actions of individual sailors were low priority. Additionally, Sullivan's actions, while critical, were not dramatic in the way that combat actions were. He did not shoot down enemy aircraft. He did not rescue drowning sailors. He did not storm a beach under fire. He shut down pumps and closed valves. From a bureaucratic perspective, he was just doing his job. The fact that doing his job saved the Pacific War was not immediately obvious to anyone, except a handful of senior officers who understood the strategic importance of the fuel reserves. Part of the answer is cultural. The American military, like all militaries, celebrated heroism in combat. Medals were awarded for acts of bravery under fire, for selflessness in the face of danger, for gallantry in battle. Sullivan's actions, while strategically crucial, did not fit that narrative. He was not a fighter pilot, or a marine rifleman, or a submarine commander. He was a mechanic, and in the hierarchy of military valor, mechanics ranked far below warriors. This was not unique to Sullivan. Thousands of logisticians, engineers, cooks, medics, and support personnel performed critical roles in World War II without receiving recognition. The cult of the warrior overshadowed the reality that modern war was won by logistics as much as by combat, and part of the answer is simply luck. Sullivan did not seek recognition. He did not write memoirs or give interviews. He did not lobby for medals or commendations. After the war, he returned to civilian life, worked as a mechanical engineer in California, raised a family, and died in 1978 at the age of 73. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Navy service, but did not detail his role at Pearl Harbor. His family knew he had been there during the attack, but he rarely spoke about it. When he did, he downplayed his own actions and emphasized the bravery of the men who fought the fires and rescued the wounded. He saw himself as a mechanic who had done his job, nothing more. The idea that his job had changed the course of the war never occurred to him. Or, if it did, he never mentioned it. But the fuel tanks he protected tell a different story. The above-ground tanks that Sullivan secured on December 7th remained operational throughout the war, supplying millions of gallons of fuel to the Pacific Fleet until the underground Red Hill facility was completed in September 1943. Even after Red Hill came online, the above-ground tanks continued to serve as backup storage and distribution points until the 1960s. Some of the tanks were demolished in the decades after the war, but a few remain standing today, rusted monuments to a forgotten crisis. And beneath them, 100 feet under volcanic rock, the 20 massive tanks of the Red Hill facility still stand. Each one large enough to hold a 20-story building, each one capable of storing 12.5 million gallons of fuel. Those tanks, built because the Roosevelt administration recognized the vulnerability of above-ground fuel storage after Pearl Harbor, are Sullivan's true legacy. In 2022, the Department of Defense announced the planned closure of Red Hill due to environmental concerns and reduced military need. The defueling process began in 2023 and was completed in December of that year. After 80 years of operation, the facility that was conceived because of Pearl Harbor and built to protect the fuel that Sullivan saved is being decommissioned. It is the end of an era, but it is also a reminder that the infrastructure of war, the unglamorous machinery of logistics and supply, is often more important than the battles themselves. Midway gets the glory. The carriers and the pilots and the admirals are celebrated. But without fuel, there is no Midway. Without mechanics like Sullivan, there is no victory. History remembers the warriors. But wars are won by the people who keep the fuel flowing. The question of why the Japanese did not attack the fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor has haunted military historians for more than 8 decades. It is one of the great what-ifs of World War II, right alongside what if the carriers had been in port, and what if the Japanese had invaded Hawaii. The answers, as we have seen, are complex and multifaceted. But one thing is certain: if the tanks had been destroyed, the course of the Pacific War would have been fundamentally different. Let us consider the counterfactual scenario. If the Japanese had destroyed the fuel reserves on December 7, 1941, the immediate effect would have been logistical paralysis. The surviving American ships at Pearl Harbor, along with the carriers that were at sea, would have had nowhere to refuel. They would have been forced to steam to the west coast, more than 2,000 miles away, to take on fuel. This would have taken weeks. During that time, the Japanese would have had free rein in the Pacific. Wake Island, which held out until December 23rd in our timeline, would have fallen faster without any hope of relief. The Philippines, which resisted until May 1942, would have been isolated and overwhelmed. Midway Island, Samoa, and even Hawaii itself would have been vulnerable to Japanese attack. More critically, the destruction of the fuel reserves would have shattered American morale, at a moment when it was already reeling. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a national trauma, a shock that galvanized the American public and united the country behind the war effort. But it was also, paradoxically, a limited defeat. Yes, battleships were sunk. Yes, thousands of Americans were killed. But the carriers survived. The repair facilities survived. The fuel survived. And within months, the Navy was striking back at Japan, demonstrating that America was not defeated, just bloodied. If the fuel had been destroyed, that narrative would have collapsed. The image of the Pacific Fleet retreating to the west coast, unable to defend Hawaii, would have been devastating. It would have played directly into Japanese propaganda about American weakness and decadence. It might even have affected strategic decisions in Washington, emboldening isolationist voices who argued that the United States should focus on Europe and abandon the Pacific. Nimitz's estimate that destroying the fuel reserves would have prolonged the war by 2 years was, if anything, conservative. Consider the timeline. In our timeline, the Battle of Midway occurred in June 1942, 7 months after Pearl Harbor. If the fuel had been destroyed, there would have been no Battle of Midway in June 1942. The American carriers would still have been operating from the west coast, unable to reach the central Pacific in time to intercept the Japanese fleet. Yamamoto's Midway operation would have succeeded, giving Japan control of the central Pacific and forcing the United States into a defensive posture. The Guadalcanal campaign, which began in August 1942 and marked the transition from defense to offense in the Pacific, would have been impossible. The Americans would not have had the fuel to support sustained offensive operations. The entire strategic dynamic of the war would have shifted. Japan, meanwhile, would have used the time to consolidate its conquests. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan's euphemism for its empire, would have had time to organize economically and militarily. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, which Japan had seized in early 1942, would have been fully operational, supplying the Japanese war machine. The fortifications on islands across the Pacific would have been stronger. The naval and air forces that Japan lost at Midway would have been available for defense. And most critically, Japan would have had time to complete the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest and most powerful battleships ever built, and deploy them as part of a defensive strategy. Breaking through those defenses would have required a level of American military power that did not exist in 1942 or even 1943. It would have taken years to build the necessary ships, train the necessary personnel, and accumulate the necessary resources. A 2-year delay in ending the war would have meant the Pacific War lasting until 1947. Millions more people would have died. The atomic bombs, if they had been ready, might have been used not on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, but on different targets in 1947. But that is not what happened. The fuel tanks survived. Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan shut down the distribution system and secured the complex. The Japanese made their catastrophic error and did not correct it. And the Pacific War followed the timeline we know. Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, the island-hopping campaign, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and finally the atomic bombs and Japanese surrender in August 1945. It was a brutal, bloody, costly war that killed millions and reshaped the world. But it ended in 1945, not 1947, and that, in the most literal sense, was thanks to the fuel. Sullivan never spoke publicly about his role. He never claimed credit. He never sought recognition. In the few conversations he had with family members about Pearl Harbor, he focused on the men who died, the sailors trapped in capsized ships, the pilots who fought hopeless battles against overwhelming odds, the civilians who were caught in the crossfire. He did not talk about fuel tanks or pump houses or valves. He did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a mechanic who had been in the right place at the right time and had done what needed to be done. And perhaps that is the most profound lesson of his story, that heroism is not always dramatic, that the most important decisions are sometimes the ones no one notices, and that history is shaped as much by mechanics shutting down fuel systems as by admirals commanding fleets. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Japanese government signed the instrument of surrender, formally ending World War II. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony, flanked by Admiral Nimitz and other senior Allied commanders. Behind them, arrayed across the bay, was the might of the United States Pacific Fleet, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. It was a display of overwhelming power, a demonstration that America had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor, but had emerged as the dominant naval force in the world. Every ship in that fleet had been fueled, at some point, by oil from Pearl Harbor. Every mission, every battle, every victory traced back to the fuel reserves that had survived. December 7, 1941. Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan was not at the surrender ceremony. He had been transferred to a logistics posting in California in 1943, where he spent the rest of the war managing fuel distribution for stateside operations. He was discharged in 1946 with the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer. Having served 22 years in the Navy, he returned to his hometown, married, had 3 children, and worked as a mechanical engineer for a petroleum company until his retirement in 1973. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He attended Pearl Harbor memorial events occasionally, but he was not a prominent figure. He did not give speeches or write articles. When people thanked him for his service, he was polite but deflecting. "I was just a mechanic," he would say. "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home." He died in 1978, 37 years after Pearl Harbor. His obituary ran in the local newspaper, a brief paragraph noting his naval service, his career as an engineer, and his survivors. There was no mention of fuel tanks or December 7th, or the decision that changed the course of the war. His family held a small funeral. A Navy honor guard presented the flag to his widow, and that was the end of Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan's story. Or so it seemed. But history has a way of rediscovering its forgotten heroes. In 2016, a historian researching logistics operations at Pearl Harbor stumbled across a fragmentary memo in the National Archives, dated December 8, 1941, referencing emergency shutdown procedures implemented by CPO Sullivan at Upper Tank Farm. The memo was incomplete, filed in the wrong box, nearly illegible, but it was enough to start asking questions. Who was CPO Sullivan? What shutdown procedures? Why was it an emergency? The historian began digging through personnel records, maintenance logs, and after-action reports. Slowly, painstakingly, the story emerged. Sullivan's actions, the fuel tanks, the narrow escape, the strategic implications. It took 5 years of research, but in 2021, on the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the historian published an article detailing Sullivan's role. It was picked up by military history journals, then by mainstream media. Suddenly, people were talking about the mechanic who saved the fuel tanks. Sullivan's surviving daughter, then in her 70s, was interviewed. She remembered her father as a quiet, humble man who rarely discussed the war. But she also remembered something he had said once, late in his life, when she had asked him what he was proudest of in his career. "I kept the fuel flowing," he had told her. "That was my job, keep the fuel flowing." At the time, she had not understood what he meant. Now she did. Today, there is no monument to Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan at Pearl Harbor. His name is not on any memorial. But the fuel tanks he saved, or at least the site where they stood, remain. And beneath them, the tunnels and tanks of the Red Hill facility, now being decommissioned, stand as monuments to the strategic vision that emerged from Pearl Harbor's vulnerability. They are reminders that wars are won not just by courage and firepower, but by logistics, infrastructure, and the unglamorous work of people like Sullivan, who keep the machines running. The great irony of Pearl Harbor is that Japan's most catastrophic error was not attacking when the carriers were out of port, not failing to invade Hawaii, but failing to destroy the fuel. Admiral Yamamoto understood this. In the months after Pearl Harbor, as the strategic situation deteriorated, he reportedly told subordinates that the attack had accomplished nothing of lasting value. The battleships, he said, were obsolete anyway. The real war would be fought with carriers, submarines, and aircraft, and all of those required fuel. By leaving the fuel intact, Japan had left America's war-making capacity intact. Everything else was just time. Sullivan knew none of this strategic calculus. He was a mechanic, but he understood fuel. And on December 7, 1941, in 2 hours of chaos and terror, he made a decision that saved it. That was enough. More than enough. Because, in the end, World War II, in the Pacific, was a war of fuel, distances, and logistics. And the side that kept the fuel flowing won.